According to some estimates, the economic cost of load shedding in South Africa shows that the economy was between 8 and 10% smaller than it could have been if the country was not plagued by the inefficiencies and inadequacies of its sole electricity provider, Eskom. Updated figures from South Africa's Efficient Group accounted for Statistics South Africa adjusting the country's GDP figures earlier in 2021. Officials said that the economy would have been between 360 billion rand to 450 billion rand larger after adjusting for things such as inflation. A further discouraging and alarming figure is that there could have been at least 1 million lost job opportunities resulting from having South Africa have a smaller economy. Established in 1923 as the country's electricity public utility, Eskom now has 392 billion rand in debt as at December 2021 from an initial 402 billion rand in the first quarter of 2021. But why has the company raked up such huge debts? One of the reasons is because Eskom has been operating and billing customers below market price for years. This is not sustainable, and the company has been working to gradually change that narrative by increasing its selling price of electricity and introducing new tariffs for all its customers. The National Energy Regulator of South Africa, NERSA, agrees with this, but Eskom and NERSA are divided on how to make this happen. NERSA's plan is noted as being more aggressive and will make South Africans pay more than the 40% of their current charge against the 20% hike which Eskom is asking for and the subsequent gradual increase. While the matter is in court, stakeholders are currently being asked to comment on the proposed tariff. The public feedback is open till January 14th, 2022. Today, we'll be looking at South Africa's Eskom as it seeks new tariff. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Joining me from South Africa is Brian Day. He's an energy advisor and renewables consultant. Brian, welcome to Business Edge and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you.
All right, so let's just have a quick background, really. The issues with Eskom have been long-standing ones for several years now. But how did we get to a point with Eskom where the company is known more for load shedding than for providing electricity to the South African economy?
I think it comes from many years. One of the key issues, of course, is that there's been a long-term lack of investment in new power production plants, notwithstanding South Africa's very successful renewable energy independent power producer procurement program, where around 6,000 megawatts of renewables has been added to the grid. Eskom has not added new generation. That's fundamentally not Eskom's fault. It was a government decision in a white paper of 1998, which unfortunately government didn't take on to legislate the content of that policy so that private power producers could play a role. Thabo Mbeki, one of our previous presidents, is on record as having apologized to Eskom for the errors of government, and the current government is trying to fast track some of those imperatives. The reality, though, is that between now and 2030 and then 2035, more than 10,000 megawatts and then up to 15,000 megawatts by 2035 of old coal-fired power stations have to be decommissioned. It's not just because it is no longer cheapest to produce from coal or to reduce the carbon emissions. It's simply a fact that the power stations are old. They've come to the end of their reliable life. It's like driving a 20-year-old car. And of course, running those old power stations has become a huge challenge for Eskom, where the availability of those power stations is just not what it would be if they were, one, new, but secondly, maintained properly over many years. And that's where Eskom is owning up to some errors since around 2010, where the idea was very much on a short-term crisis management to try and keep the lights on, rather than doing the necessary maintenance, which of course requires you to turn power stations off for long enough to do the necessary repairs. And Andre de Ruyter, our current group exec of Eskom, is on record as saying it's like driving an old car but never servicing it.
All right, so that brings us up to speed a bit in terms of how Eskom got to this situation. Now, the company is asking for a tariff increase. This comes at a point in time where South Africa's economy is just about a year out of recession, like many economies on the continent, struggling to get out from under the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So let me ask this. When last did Eskom review its tariff upward? Because a review does not necessarily mean it increases. It could mean it stays the same or even decreases. But when last did Eskom get an upward tariff review?
The system in the country is that there's an annual tariff increase. The tariff increase is effective for Eskom's direct customers on the 1st of April every year. And then that increase is then passed on through the municipalities, which form the main distributors in the country, to everything but the very big clients on the 1st of July of every year. So it's a regular system. It's known as the multi-year price determination system. And there is an agreement by the regulator, NERSA, which you mentioned in your intro, of how these increases would be calculated. And the key principle is, what is their allowable revenue? Now, unfortunately, we're sitting with an archaic system in the country where we still have the monopoly utility. It's no longer fit for purpose. That doesn't mean that it wasn't fit for purpose in its day. The challenge is that you're trying to regulate an entity when competition in the generation space would add significantly to being able to work out what the allowable revenue should be, rather than trying to regulate it. Of course, the transmission network wouldn't be a natural monopoly, and that's where regulation would be wholly advisable. So competition in generation, for me, would actually get past the current issue, and perhaps we can get onto that later around the unbundling of Eskom, which is a prerequisite for such competition to happen. In the meantime, though, NERSA is obligated to deal with the price escalation applications from Eskom. Unfortunately, NERSA is in disarray. They are have tried to impose an undefined, unclear new methodology too late in the day for Eskom to then make a new application, even though they had already, last year already, made an application under the existing, or inverted commas, old methodology. That's what led to one of the court cases. And unfortunately, the NERSA is not winning anything when Eskom take them to court at the moment.
So it's interesting now that this is in court, and as you're saying, the regulator is looking to introduce a new form of calculating this multi-year tariff review or an increase, and Eskom has already made a request for the old methodology to be used. And you said NERSA is not winning anything as it comes now. But when you look at the two plans, overall, which one, even regardless of how they came to be, which one does make more sense in the point in time that South Africa finds itself? The question really is it 20%? Is it 40%? Is it even 10%? Or is it anything? So, Brian, which plan makes sense?
The unfortunate issue is that the 20% that Eskom are talking about, around 20%, versus approximately 40%, which NERSA talk about, are not based on fundamentally different numbers at the core. It's what you include and what you exclude. Now, one of the main issues is what they call the regulatory clearing account, because there are certain assumptions made in the allowable revenue calculation. But of course, life doesn't ever work out exactly as predicted. For example, the amount of diesel used in our so-called gas turbines, even though they run on diesel, which is hugely expensive, the total sales that Eskom achieve. One is an increased cost, one is a reduced revenue. Those are variables in the methodology and are corrected at the end of each year through the regulatory clearing account. And there are different elements of this brought to bear when NERSA says that it's a 40% increase, when the underlying primary increase is actually the 20-odd% which Eskom referred to.
All right. So, Brian, before we go for a break, while this is the increases are regular because they're also written into the legislation or sort of the regulatory environment around Eskom, there really is also a question that we need to ask. Does the company really have a case for asking for any increase? Let's remove the fact that this is expected year on year, as it is, without that being a regular point in this case. Does Eskom really have a case for asking for South Africans and South African businesses at this point in time to pay more for electricity that they're barely getting?
I think that's a very fair question. And I think for all of us, increases would be more palatable if we really had a conviction that Eskom was doing everything they could to run in an efficient, prudent manner. I think huge strides and advances have been made in recent years under the leadership of Mr. Andre de Ruyter and Jan Oberholzer, the Chief Operating Officer, and the team at Eskom, because Eskom is fundamentally, for the most part, made up of brilliant people. We all know the state capture issues and the imprudent, wasteful expenditure and just plain corruption that has happened, and that is being rooted out. Until, though, there is a confidence that Eskom is actually doing everything in their power, including eliminating load shedding, the general public will not feel that the increases are palatable. But in your intro, you also referred, though, to the long-term lack of increases that were provided. And that was, in a way, right, and in a way, a critical error. It was imperative at the time, for developmental purposes in the country, not to increase electricity tariffs too much. One of the great advancements between Eskom and the new government post-1994 is to increase household electrification rates from around 35% in 1994 to the current level of around 87%. And therefore, Eskom and government really do need to be applauded. However, you also needed to take into account the fact that these old power stations were completely amortized. They had paid off, they were old. It's like having a 3-year or 5-year loan on your car, and the car's now 8 years old. You're in a very fortunate position that you're only paying the current servicing costs. However, at some point, two things happen. Firstly, it starts breaking so often that you can't actually afford to fix it anymore. But secondly, you need to have saved up at least a deposit to put into a new car. And that element of investment into the new generation capacity was not done through the 2000s and 2010s. And it's because of that that you now see Eskom and government and NERSA trying to catch up. Therefore, it's not actually correct to just look at what the percentage increase is from last year, because what the tariff was over the last 10 years may or may not have been correct. So you actually need to take a fundamental new look, but in an unbundled system, where the tariff for the transmission network and the extensive expansions that are required on the transmission network to facilitate distributed generation, in other words, smaller renewable plants spread right across the country, rather than very large, mostly coal plants located where the coal resource is, where it's sitting underground. And the grid expansion for that is a massive challenge, and of course that also has to be funded. What is also true is that there was a lot of wasteful expenditure on Medupi and Kusile, and even now only 3 of the units at Kusile, for example, are synchronized to the grid. The fourth one was synchronized recently, but that doesn't reach commercial operation. Only when each of those units reaches commercial operation are those elements of the debt brought to bear into the books, and therefore becomes part of the actual tariff. So we're in for a rough ride in terms of future electricity tariffs, until we get to a point where the new renewable capacity at much lower costs can actually start to dilute the tariff slightly. But we must take note, of course, as well, that actually internationally, our electricity tariff is still very competitive. However, with the amount of load shedding we've got, that places a huge risk on businesses, especially those that, for example, lose a whole batch or have to start a whole process again when they have a power outage. It's not just losing a production for that hour, that 2 hours, that 4 hours. It could have far more impact than that. And then, of course, there's all the funding that's spent on alternative supply, backups, batteries, etc.
Yes. All right, Brian, we're going to get into the unbundling conversation. I know you want to talk about that. Then we'll also talk about what municipalities are requesting as well, even in the context of Eskom's current situation. So, Brian, just hold on. We're going to take a quick break. But billions of rand have gone into making Eskom work, and right now it still is not. And many are tired of waiting for South Africa's sole electricity public utility to do what it should. When we come back, what options are available and who is looking to do what? This is Business Edge. Stay with us. And still with me is Brian Day, South African Energy Advisor and Renewables Consultant, as we look at South Africa's Eskom's request for a tariff increase. Now, South Africans and South African businesses are tired of waiting for Eskom to sort itself. We saw a request from municipalities to be able to generate their own power, and Eskom has said it will challenge this request. So, Brian, is this the way to go? As it is with the municipalities right now, what does that request stand? What's the future of that request as well?
I think there are two elements to the request. The first part is the current application to our courts through the South African Local Government Association is for municipalities to have the sole right to distribute electricity in their regions of management. Now, Eskom also has a distribution division, and in some areas they supply the smaller households directly. For example, Sandton and Soweto, both part of the Greater Johannesburg. That's where there's a massive problem in that the municipal tariffs are higher because there are surcharges on the electricity that municipalities sell to their customers, because that's one of the main sources of income for those municipalities. Eskom then sells at a lot lower rate to these households and other customers. And of course, you then have a very inopportune tariff situation and an incentive for customers to move their business from areas supplied by a municipality into areas supplied directly by Eskom. And that's the issue where the municipalities are challenging for a sole right to distribute electricity. What is also happening, which is a slightly older issue, is that municipalities want to actually produce their own electricity, whether that's to own the generation plant themselves or to procure it from independent power producers. They would then have an alternative wholesale inputs of electricity to be able to sell to their clients. And again, we're sitting with an over-regulated situation in the country. The regulations were written, and they are part of our Electricity Regulation Act. It's an act of Parliament from 2006. It was written at a time when Eskom was the sole provider of electricity. It did not foresee the situation that you have now, where you have substantial numbers of independent power producers distributed across the country, renewable sources, cheaper, cleaner. Obviously variable in their production, so that's where the grid system actually comes to play. But you actually have to have a much more deregulated system to allow for the sort of competition which can give you much better price signals in the generation space. Now, I'm not suggesting that the transmission grid should be anything but properly regulated, because that's how you actually get electricity to all of the businesses and the people, and you actually have a just and equitable system. But that is achieved through the transmission network, not through generation.
Okay.
Who puts that electron onto the grid actually is a completely separate issue. And municipalities and the private sector should have the opportunity to do that. Fortunately, governments has recently taken a huge step forward, that under that Electricity Regulation Act, they have a Schedule 2, which now has been extended, that there's an opportunity for private sector to invest in power generation plants up to 100 megawatts and sell to multiple private off-takers instead of the previous limitation, which was sitting at 1 megawatt. And this is going to open up the opportunity for private deals substantially and actually support Eskom in supplying enough electricity for all the needs in the country.
All right. So, Brian, I have to get to this before we go before we wrap things up. Now, it was also last year that President Cyril Ramaphosa mentioned that he would start the process of unbundling Eskom. We've seen the unbundling of our power producer or manager, whatever you want to call them, here in Nigeria. It's become multiple distribution companies across the country, but there's still issues. There's still the tariff conversations here as well, I'm very sure you're aware of. So when you hear about the unbundling of Eskoms, it's not necessarily as soon as it's done, it's a solution to everything. But where is South Africa in that process? And would it really help to make a difference for Eskom, for South Africans and their businesses to unbundle the company?
The unbundling of Eskom is a necessary and long overdue step, but it's also only the very first step. Because you mentioned multiple distribution companies. At the moment, we're only talking about an independent transmission company, which is much more at the wholesale level, not even delving into the more regional distributors. That is also needed. The good news is that process started within Eskom 2-3 years ago already. In fact, it was considered way back in 2003, and politics tripped them up. Eskom were well on the way to actually doing some of the right things. So President Ramaphosa's announcement was a confirmation of something that was already happening.
Okay.
The team at Eskom have worked very hard to actually create a separate subsidiary for now, which is largely set up. The 3 divisions have their own boards. There are conditions precedent on that actually being operationalized, and that is lenders agreements and licensing approvals from NERSA. But it is imminent and is a very, very positive step. It is hugely necessary, because then that will be the entity that buys power from both private power producers and from the generators that are still owned by Eskom. And you'll get a form of independence and some proper competition to do what competition is best suited to do.
All right, Brian, we'll wrap the conversation here, but we're going to wait to see what happens by January 14th when the public feedback and comments on the plan are done, and then we'll watch how things play out with the court case between NERSA and Eskom to see what the year holds for electricity conversation in South Africa. Brian Day, first time on Business Edge, but hopefully not the last. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And you see, with South Africa being the continent's most advanced economy, we cannot stop talking about the electricity situation. It's said that load shedding will continue into the near future. How will that affect the economy, and what impact will it have on South African businesses? We'll be watching very closely to the end of the month to see how things play out between NERSA and Eskom, and of course with the public comments on the planned tariff increase. This is Business Edge, I beg your pardon. Up next is NC4 to watch. And we start with talking about one of the shiniest, most valuable materials in the world, and that is gold. Now, gold prices rose on Tuesday, supported by a weaker U.S. dollar and Treasury yields as traders await December inflation data and possible interest rate hikes. Now, spot gold rose 0.3% to $1,805 per ounce. U.S. gold futures were up 0.4% to $1,805. Barrick Gold, which owns Mali's biggest gold mine complex, has said its mines in the country have thus far not been affected by sanctions imposed by the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. Egypt's annual urban consumer price inflation accelerated to 5.9% year-on-year in December from 5.6% in November. Data from the country's statistics agency showed that the headline indicator showed inflation at minus 0.1% compared to 0.1% a month prior. And finally, Kenya has stepped up oil and gas exploration activities in the Lamu Basin weeks after rejecting a ruling over a 4-decade maritime dispute with Somalia. And it's a wrap on today's Business Edge. Don't forget that you can follow us on social media at News Central TV. Download our mobile app and take us with you wherever you go. And also visit our website and make sure you're up to date with the latest coming from the African continent. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. I'll see you again soon.